Just Maybe. Written by Hannah Jo Abbott. Chapter 1. Carrie Stevens looked at the clock and realized she had been studying for 3 hours straight. She blinked her eyes a few times to clear her head and rolled her head to stretch out the muscles in her neck. She tucked her shoulder-length blonde hair behind her ears and heard her stomach growl, as another reminder that she hadn't stopped for a break of any kind. But that's the kind of determination she would need to finish her undergraduate degree with straight A's and move on to medical school. Although I guess I do need to eat at some point, she thought. People said she was thin enough without missing meals. As if on cue, her cell phone vibrated on the table. She grabbed it to quiet the noise in the otherwise silent study area of the campus library. She glanced at the message, a group text between some of her friends. Pizza, it read. Her phone vibrated again as others started sending their responses. She saw Jack's name where he answered, yes. She couldn't help the smile that spread across her face at the thought of her friend. Carrie, are you still at the library? I'm close, I'll swing by and pick you up. She knew it was futile to argue, and anyway, she was hungry and needed a break. She sent back a message to let him know she would be out front in 5 minutes. After gathering her things into her backpack, she headed out. And there he was, punctual and faithful as usual. Jack Pierce parked at the curb and jumped out to open the passenger side door for Carrie, just like his mama taught him. His dark hair was combed, but wet, as if he had just showered. Carrie noticed the familiar scent of his aftershave, a warm, woodsy smell. She assumed he had come from playing basketball and showered off afterward. He was tall and athletic, a true all-American boy. Studying hard? He asked with a smile. Always. She tossed her backpack in the floor of his car and climbed in. They talked about classes as they made their way to the pizza place just 10 minutes away. Who else said they were coming? I didn't finish looking at the text, Jack said, his attention on the road. She picked up her phone and scrolled through the names. Kevin, Mandy, and Blake said yes. Julie said she can't. Mike is at work. And Rachel said she's coming and bringing Scott. Carrie and Jack had met their freshman year at Auburn University at a campus Bible study. Their group of friends had formed from that group study, and they did everything together. Late-night hangouts, football games, spring break trips, study sessions. Everyone in the group knew they were always a text message away. Sounds good, Jack said of the group that would be there tonight. I'm starving after playing basketball. I figured that's where you had been to need a shower at this hour. What are you talking about? I'm always fresh and clean. He gave his head a little shake and water droplets splattered onto Carrie. Hey, she shouted, I don't need a shower, thank you very much. Are you sure? Do you even know how long you've been at the library? You might not know how long it's been since you've had a shower, he teased. She shrugged, just trying to make a good grade in my organic chemistry class. You know, you really shouldn't worry that much. You make good grades in all your classes. She tilted her head at him. I know, that's because I spend so much time studying. Okay, fair enough, he held his hands up in surrender. I just want to know when you're going to take a break long enough to go out with me. She cut her eyes at him and tried to keep from smiling. But she couldn't stop the blush that crept over her face. I've told you, I can't be in a relationship right now. I've got to focus on school. Yes, so you've said. But if I keep asking, then one day you're going to have to say yes. She rolled her eyes at him. You just tell yourself whatever makes you feel better. But she knew that the day he stopped asking, she would feel the disappointment. 30 minutes later, the group of friends sat around their usual booth with pizzas spread out across the table. They laughed and chatted comfortably between all of them. Rachel sat next to Carrie and Mandy, while the boys sat on the other side of the round table. She elbowed Carrie between a bite of pizza. So Jack picked you up to come? She grinned while dropping her voice to just above a whisper. Yes, he did. And nothing. I had seen him earlier and said I was headed to the library, so he guessed that I was still there. Well, of course you were. What's wrong with that? Nothing. But come on, Carrie, when are you going to say yes to Jack and go out with him? Come on, Ratch, we've talked about this. What are you girly girls whispering about? Blake's voice rose above the other conversations at the table. Carrie gave Rachel a look that said she better not say. Rachel paid no attention. I'm just asking Carrie when she's going to say yes and go out with Jack, she announced. Carrie wanted to hide. It wasn't a secret among the group that Jack frequently asked Carrie to go on a date, but she still didn't want to talk about it. I guess we all want to know that. So why don't we just open it up for discussion? Kevin jumped in. Everyone at the table spoke out in agreement. Carrie held up her hands. Guys, I love y'all, but it's really not a group discussion. You know that I have a no dating policy, and that includes Jack. Sorry, Jack, she shrugged. Ah, come on now, Blake spoke, give the poor guy a break. He's only been asking you out for 2 years. Yeah, and anyway, I don't think you can decide it's not a group thing, Mandy said. We've all been there for each other since freshman year. And when one of us needs help, we always help them out, right? Carrie looked around at everyone waiting on her to answer. Of course, but I don't see what that has to do with it. Jack needs help. He's been asking out a girl for 2 years. And her only reason is her no dating policy. So we need to help him out and convince the girl to go out with him. As Jack's friends, it's our duty, Mandy reasoned. What about your duty as my friends? Carrie pleaded. As your friends, we want to look out for your best interest. So it's time for you to say yes. Go on a date with Jack. We won't take no for an answer. Mandy crossed her arms and leaned back in her seat. Jack, who hadn't uttered a word, nodded at the group's logic. He smiled across the table at Carrie and waited. I feel like y'all are ganging up on me. I think that was our goal, Rachel pretended to whisper. So, she asked. Well, are you going to ask? Carrie looked at Jack. I've asked 1,000,000 times, but I will again. Carrie, will you go out to dinner with me? She sighed and signified her surrender. All right. Everyone around the table cheered. Jack smiled the biggest smile of anyone. She wasn't sure what she had just gotten herself into. Chapter 2. Carrie stood in front of the mirror trying to tame her hair into some kind of style. It wasn't going well. She was sweating with nervousness. It was Saturday afternoon, and Jack was picking her up at 5:30. She finally brushed her hair straight and decided to leave it alone. What is wrong with me? She asked herself out loud. It's not like I've never eaten with Jack before. Or been alone with him. But she knew this was different. Why did I say yes to this? I shouldn't have let them pressure me into it. She paused and sat down on the desk chair in her dorm room. I also should stop talking to myself. But her thoughts continued. I agreed so that he will stop asking. We will go to dinner. I'll tell him we're better off as friends because I have to focus right now. And that will be that. With that decided, she finished getting ready. Jack had said to dress casually, so she wore a black and white stripped sleeveless dress that ended at her knees. She put some finishing touches on her light makeup. She added earrings, put on shoes and grabbed her purse. A few minutes later she stood outside of her dorm building and waited on Jack to pull up at the curb. She didn't want to be late since she expected he would be right on time. Which he was, as always. You look lovely, Jack said as he opened the car door for her. He wore khaki shorts and a light green polo shirt. Thanks, she smiled, sliding into the seat. So where are we going? She asked once they were on their way. Jack wiggled his eyebrows up and down. It's a surprise. Oh, come on, tell me. Nope, I don't want to spoil it. So you've got it all figured out. Trust me, he gave her a smile. I've been planning this for a long time. Her heart fluttered and she could feel her palms start to sweat. She tried to reply, but nothing came out. She sat back in her seat and tried to breathe. We'll be better off as friends, we'll be better off as friends, she repeated her line to herself, determined to keep her guard up. It wasn't long before they turned down a gravel road lined on both sides with rows of trees, and Carrie started laughing. Is this one of those scary movies where you take me off into the woods and I disappear? Jack laughed too. I know, it's a little unusual. But I figured we've been to eat most places in town with the group. That's true. It wasn't far down the gravel road they came to a clearing. There was a house and a fenced-in field, but the focal point was a large wooden barn. The barn was tall, going up to a point above the second-story loft. On the front were large sliding doors painted with gray outlines that accented the whitewash of the barn. The sides held a row of large, plate glass windows, and the late afternoon sun streamed in on the spring day. Carrie caught her breath at the sight. This is pretty. I thought you might like it. He pulled to the side of the barn and parked. Come on. They climbed out of the car and Jack went to the trunk where he pulled out a large picnic basket and a quilt. You are prepared, Carrie said. I told you, he winked at her. Whose place is this? An older couple from my church back home owns it. Their daughter runs it as an event venue, but they said we could use it. I guess it's nice to have connections, she said as they walked. Behind the barn the ground was flat, and the grass was soft and green. Jack laid out the blanket and told her to take a seat. He pulled out sandwiches, bottles of sweet tea, and her favorite chip sweet barbecue. Carrie sat speechless at his thoughtfulness and preparation. She had always known he was a guy who paid attention to details, but she had never realized how nice that was. Thanks, was all she could say as he handed her a sandwich and took a seat to eat his own. You're welcome. Thank you for agreeing to come. He stopped and gave an exaggerated eye roll. Finally. He stretched out the word. She reached out and pushed his arm playfully. You just had to drag our friends into it to get me to say yes. He held his hands up. Nope, I had nothing to do with that. Nothing, she asked. I didn't ask them to do that, he said seriously, but you know that they all know how long I've been asking you out. Anyway, let's talk about something else. Yes, let's. Did you plan conversation topics too? She teased. He rolled with it. Sure, tell me all your hopes and dreams, he smiled. She laughed. All of them? Yep, I've got plenty of time. You know them though. My dream is to finish college, go to medical school, and become a pediatrician to help kids. It's what I've always wanted to do. And why is that? The question surprised her. What do you mean? What made you want to do that? She shrugged. Kids need someone in their corner. Someone to take care of them. Not all kids get that, but I want to be someone that can help them. And being a pediatrician is the only way to do that? I don't know if it's the only way, but it's a pretty good way. I agree. I'm not arguing, just asking a question. Okay, she crossed her arms, feeling defensive. What about having your own kids? You know, a family of your own. I don't know. You don't know? No, I don't. My first priority is school and a career. After that's established, if I feel like I can make that work, then maybe. Jack took a bite of his sandwich. What? Nothing. Is there something wrong with wanting a career? No, not at all. But there's something wrong with not knowing if I want a family, she said flatly. No, I'm sure you'll figure that out. She felt her pulse rising. Listen, Jack, not everyone has a picture-perfect family like you do. You had it good, but family isn't always all it's cracked up to be. He gently reached out and took hold of her arm. I'm sorry. You're right. You should know that my family isn't perfect. But I think that having a family means you have a chance to do it differently. The family you have doesn't have to be like the family you grew up with. She bit her lip and thought about that. Maybe. I'll take a maybe. So what about you? Tell me all your hopes and dreams. She pushed away thoughts of family and focused on him. You know, finish college, get a decent job, have a family. Just the American dream, he smiled. Sounds so simple when you say it. Maybe it is, he raised his eyebrows as a challenge. Just maybe, her eyes met his and for just a minute she could picture that kind of future. She let it linger there as her gaze lowered to his lips. She wondered what it would be like to lean in and kiss him. Jack cleared his throat, and the sound jarred Carrie out of her thoughts. So anyway, these sandwiches are good. Her voice sounded awkward, even to herself. Thanks. Did you make them? He laughed. No, I picked them up from the grocery store deli. Well, they're good. I'll have to remember that. Are you ready for dessert? There's dessert too? Of course. What kind of date would it be without dessert? He seemed to emphasize the word date, and Carrie stiffened, remembering her resolve, and what she wanted to tell him. She opened her mouth but got distracted when Jack pulled chocolate brownies from the picnic basket. Yum! She nearly shouted, chocolate is my favorite. I know, he said offhandedly. She shook her head and tried to focus. Jack, I need to tell you something. Shhh, he put his finger up to his mouth. Enjoy your dessert. The movie is about to start. Movie? She asked in surprise. She glanced around to see what he could be talking about. She noticed the bare, white wood of the barn, and when she looked behind them she saw a crate with a cover, and an extension cord coming out the bottom. Jack got up and ran over to the crate and lifted the cover to reveal a projector and loudspeakers. She laughed. Are you for real? She couldn't hide how pleased she was. You really planned all this? For you, he smiled as he made his way back to the blanket. She laughed again. What movie are we watching? He took his seat next to her and whispered, it's all a surprise. She took a moment to take it all in. Jack's nearness to her on the blanket, the movie flickering on the side of the barn, the delicious brownie in her hand. A surprise? Yes, it is. Chapter 3. Carrie walked to class on Monday morning thinking about Jack. Even though they had known each other before, something had changed. She had always known that he liked her, but he didn't push himself on her beyond asking her on a date about once a month. He had always been a kind friend, despite her refusal of his proposition. But being with him on that date, it was as if she had allowed him to treat her special. And she couldn't help but admit that she enjoyed that special treatment. A smile spread across her face as she entered the science building for her class. The lecture started, but she had trouble paying attention. She could hear Jack's voice on their drive back to campus. So was this as bad as you expected? I didn't expect it to be bad. But it was much better than I could have imagined. Jack had simply smiled and said nothing. Now she almost sighed at how perfect it had been. When the professor wrapped up class she was shocked that it was over, and she had no idea what he had been talking about. She started to panic just a little, but calmed herself with the reminder that she could read the chapter and look at the online class notes. It will be fine just this once, she told herself. Hey Carrie, Rachel met her in the hallway outside of class. The two went to the same class next and always walked across campus together. Hey Rach, how is everything? Good, but I don't want to talk about me. How was your date? She squealed the last word as she gripped Carrie's arm with both hands. Carrie rolled her eyes at her dramatic friend. It was fine. Just fine. It was nice. Nice? Yes, Jack is very nice. He's always been very nice. But was he especially nice on your date? She emphasized the word date. Carrie looked away to hide the look in her eyes. Yes, he was. But you know that it was just one date. That's all I agreed to. But that doesn't mean there won't be a second one. Rachel wiggled her eyebrows. We've all known you two should get together. Carrie held up her hand to her friend. Don't push me, okay? I said I would go on one date, and I did. Jack is nice, but we're better off as friends. Rachel said as if she didn't really believe her. All right, I won't say anything else. Besides, I would rather wait and say I told you so. Carrie rolled her eyes again and picked up her pace to get to class. She desperately tried to put Jack out of her mind. I need to actually listen in class this time. Carrie pulled out her phone as soon as she was out of class. She had a missed call from Jack. She sighed. I hope he knows it was just one date. Maybe he's calling because he needs something. She tried to convince herself that's what she hoped for as she hit the button to call him back. Hey Jack, I saw that you called. I did, I assumed you were in class. Yep, just got out. Cool, he paused, it sounded like he was uncertain about saying anything else. Did you need something? She asked, bracing herself for the answer. I just haven't seen you since the other night, so I wanted to see how you were doing. I'm good, she slowed her walk and waved at Rachel to go on. Rachel looked curious, but allowed her friend some privacy. Good, I'm glad you're good. I just wanted to see if you wanted to get dinner tomorrow night. You know it's Taco Tuesday, I know you love tacos. Jack, I hope you haven't gotten the wrong idea. I know, you don't want to get too involved. We won't call it a date, we'll just call it hanging out. I don't know, sounds like a date. But you really like tacos. I do really like tacos, she paused. So don't you think you would really like eating tacos with a really good friend? Carrie could hear his smile through the phone. Oh, all right. But I can't be gone too long, I have a test the next morning, so I need to study. Fair enough, he said, I'll pick you up at 5. See you then, Carrie. Bye, Jack. She sighed as she put her phone back into her backpack and started walking towards her dorm. She was beginning to see that there were a few things she didn't know about her friend. And for starters, she hadn't known how persistent he could be. Chapter 4. Jack had called Thursday evening and Carrie was stressed. Hey, she said unenthusiastically. What's wrong? Nothing, I'm just trying to study. And I think I did terribly on my test yesterday. She wanted to blame him that she hadn't studied as much as she planned to after tacos on Tuesday, but she stopped short of that. I'm sorry, I'm sure you did all right. You still have the final for that class, right? Yeah. Then don't worry about that for now. Sure, that will be easy, she said a little too sarcastically. I have something to take your mind off of it. Oh, you do? Yep, tomorrow I'm going home for the weekend. Pack your bags and head to Casa de Pierce for the weekend. Jack, she had been to the Pierce's house before, all of their friends had, but never to spend the whole weekend. And definitely never alone with Jack. Don't worry, everyone is invited, he said as if he read her mind. Kevin and Mike are coming, Julie and Rachel and Scott too. Maybe a couple others. It's my mom's birthday, and she would love nothing more than a house full of people to fuss over. Carrie couldn't help but laugh at that. Jack's mom was the most hospitable person she had ever met. She took everyone in the moment she met them, and she felt sure Jack was right about how she would want to celebrate her birthday. Okay, then. I wouldn't want to disappoint your mom. I didn't think so. Not that you ever would, anyway. What time are you done with class tomorrow? At 2. Perfect, I'll be by your dorm at 3. I'm glad you can come. Now it was Friday evening and Carrie stood outside the Pierce's home with her duffel bag over her shoulder. The car ride was only a couple of hours, but it had been loud. Besides Jack in the front, and Carrie beside him, Kevin and Mike had ridden in the back seat, and the friends talked and laughed the entire ride. Her friends had been a good distraction for Carrie, and for that she was thankful. As the boys piled out of the vehicle, a second car pulled into the driveway, and out came Julie, Rachel, and her boyfriend, Scott. They all greeted each other and headed to the door. Before they could reach the front porch, the door opened and Gladys Pierce welcomed all of them. Hello, hello, she waved both of her perfectly manicured hands. I'm so glad y'all could come. She went to hug Jack first, and then each of his friends in turn. Carrie. Before she knew what was happening, she was enveloped in a full hug. She remembered that the Pierce family was affectionate, something very different than her own family. Hi, Mrs. Pierce, she said, almost out of breath. Happy birthday. Oh, thank you, dear. I'm so glad you're here to celebrate with us. She pulled back and gave Carrie a wink. What was that for? Carrie thought, has Jack told her something? Not that there's something to tell, but what if? She cut herself off and determined not to worry about that now. Everyone was headed into the house, and Carrie quickly made her way to link arms with Julie and Rachel, and planned to stick with her gal pals for the rest of the evening. That proved easy to do, since the guys ate quickly and headed out back to play basketball. The girls offered to help Mrs. Pierce clean up from the meal. "I think I would like having girls around more often," Gladys said as she hugged each girl and thanked them for their help. Once the dishes were done and the table and counters wiped off, Carrie, Julie, and Rachel lounged on the large sectional in the living room. They chatted about school, work, and upcoming events. But it didn't take long for the conversation to turn to boys. "So Rachel, do you think Scott will wait until you graduate to propose?" Julie's voice sounded dreamy at the thought. Rachel waved her hand. "Oh, who knows what goes on in that boy's mind. I mean, we've talked a little about the future, but he's not ready to make any plans." "I think you have plenty of time," Carrie said. "Yes, and what about you and Jack? Tell us all the details." SHHHH. Carrie desperately tried to quiet her friends. "His parents might hear you." "So?" Rachel didn't seem bothered. "I'm pretty sure they already know how Jack feels." She gave an almost wicked smile. "Don't leave us hanging, we want to know everything," Julie added. Carrie tucked her feet underneath her on the couch and tried to act nonchalant. "There's really nothing to tell. You guys all wanted me to go on a date with him, so I did." She shrugged. "That's it." "Oh, come on, we know you went out again the other night," Rachel said. "That was just dinner as friends," Carrie said plainly. "Is that what you're telling yourself?" Rachel challenged her. "No, it's the truth. I haven't changed my mind about wanting to be in a relationship. School is my priority." "For how long?" Rachel asked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you going to spend your whole life not being in a relationship?" Rachel asked. "I'll see what happens once I'm settled in a career. Maybe I will, maybe I won't." Julie chimed in. "I think you may already be in a relationship, and you don't even realize it." "How can that be?" Carrie's eyes flew open wide. "Well, all of us think you and Jack are an item. Haven't you heard of two-function assumption?" "What's that?" "You know, 2 dates with a guy and then people assume you're together." "But we went out once, I told you the other time was as friends." Well, we'll just see about that. When the guys come back in, we'll see who Jack comes in and sits by," Julie said. "We're not a couple," Carrie insisted. "We'll see," Rachel agreed with Julie. They didn't have to wait long. In only a few minutes the guys came in, sweaty and thirsty. They all headed into the kitchen to get cups of water, and then came to join the girls in the living room. Scott took his seat next to Rachel, and Kevin and Mike sprawled out on the floor. Carrie's heart pounded as she noticed the space next to her, and the other still empty spaces on the couch. The girls all watched as Jack made his way around the living room, stepped over Kevin and Mike on the floor, and took a seat right next to Carrie. Carrie felt her face flush, and she wasn't sure if the sudden heat in the room was from the nearness of someone who had just finished a game of basketball, or the emotion rising in her chest. Either way, she knew she was in trouble. Chapter 5. On Sunday afternoon, Carrie made sure to ride back to campus with the other girls. She wanted to distance herself from Jack. She knew she needed to talk to him, but not in a car full of people. Monday went by in a rush of classes, homework, and washing clothes in the dorm laundry room, so she didn't find time to talk to him. He sent her a couple of texts, but she only responded that she was busy. He seemed to let that be that and didn't text again. Carrie dreaded going to her chemistry class on Tuesday. She had worried off and on about her test all weekend, and she both wanted to know, and was afraid to find out her score. Hoping it couldn't be that bad, she walked into class and sat attentively through the lecture. She made sure to take careful notes. Finally, the last 5 minutes of class arrived, and the professor had his assistant hand out the tests. The TA called each name and handed the exam to the students upside down. Carrie's heart pounded when she heard her name and quickly made her way to the front. Once the test was in her hand, she took a deep breath and flipped it over. She gasped and her hand flew to her mouth when she saw the red marker announcing 79. 79? She thought frantically, 79. That's AC. She couldn't remember the last time she had gotten AC. In fact, she couldn't remember the last time she had gotten AB. She had worked hard to make all A's during her college career. But AC. This was unacceptable. Panicked, she walked quickly out of class and out the front door of the building. She heard Rachel call her name as she made it to the sidewalk, but she ignored her. She pulled out her phone and texted Jack, "We need to talk, meet me after class outside the history building." She sent it and jammed her phone back in her bag as she made her way to her next class. Sitting through the lecture was excruciating. She wanted to leave and find Jack right away, but that would mean giving up more class time on the whole thing, and she couldn't do that now. He would have to wait. And then it would be done. She bolted out of the room as soon as the professor dismissed them. She didn't bother looking at her phone, but made her way outside where Jack was pacing the sidewalk. "Hey," she said. His face was filled with worry. "Hey, are you okay? I sent you back 5 text messages." "I was in class," was all she said. "What's going on? Come on, let's walk. I want to go somewhere where there's less people." "Okay." He fell in step beside her, and they walked across campus in silence. They made their way to a bench a little off the main path between buildings. There were still a few people walking through, but not the large crowd exiting classes all at once. Once they were seated, Carrie didn't waste any time. "Jack, this isn't going to work." "What?" "We can't be a couple." "Why not?" "So you're not even denying that that's what's happening? We're turning into a couple?" "I have no reason to deny it. I feel like I've made my feelings pretty clear." "Yes, you have. But so have I." "And you don't want to be a couple," he stated matter-of-factly. Carrie sighed. She could see the hurt in his eyes. "I told you, this is a time when I need to focus on school. That hasn't changed, and I've been pretty clear about that." "But why can't you do both?" His voice sounded so sincere. "I think I've proven that I can't do that. I just got my chemistry test back, and I got AC." "AC?" She raised her hands and her voice together. "Oh," he dropped his gaze, "and you think that it's because we went on one date, you got a bad grade?" "2 dates," she said. Jack looked like he wanted to protest, but he stopped himself. "And Tuesday night I should have been studying for my test, but I was out with you instead. And it was too much fun to leave." He looked at her, seeming hopeful for the first time during their conversation. "So you enjoyed it?" He smiled. "Yes, I did," she admitted, "but that's just the point. I can't make this work. School has to come first, and if I'm tempted to be distracted then, well, I just can't. You know, one bad grade in a class isn't the end of the world. It is to me. It's not even your final grade. You still have the final to make it up, and I'm sure you already have a decent grade in the class. Decent isn't good enough for medical school. And medical school is the most important thing?" She sighed. "Look, Jack, I don't expect you to understand. Try me." She looked away and considered getting up and leaving, but something in his voice made her stay. She opened her mouth and the words flowed before she could stop them. "Jack, you grew up with the perfect family. Your parents found a way to be a family and show you and your brothers that they cared about you all the time. And they managed to work at the same time. But it wasn't like that for me." Jack put his hand on her arm and it stopped her for just a moment, but he pulled his hand away and she continued. "My parents had careers. They never really said it, but I don't think they ever planned on having me. I guess once they did, they were stuck. I grew up with parents who worked more hours than I could count and more babysitters than I remember. I do remember that I tried and tried to work hard in school and do well so they would notice and maybe they would be proud of me. But when I came home with a good grade, it was more like, of course I did well. That's what they expected, and anything less would be unacceptable." She stopped to dab her eyes at the tears that were threatening. "I reached a point that I knew they would never be proud or impressed, so I changed my mind about what I wanted to do. I decided I wanted to be a pediatrician where I could help kids and let them know that they are special. But I also decided that having a relationship and a family might not be in the cards for me. But why? Wouldn't you want the chance to do things differently than your parents did? No, her eyes were wide with shock at the suggestion. I don't want to risk hurting someone I care about by not having time for them. I would never want to give a family less than my best, so if I have to choose, I choose career. I think it's safer that way. She sniffed and then let out a heavy sigh, as if she had carried the weight of that truth for a very long time. They sat in silence for a few moments, letting her statement sink in for both of them. Finally Jack spoke. "Carrie," he said gently. He waited until her eyes met his. "It doesn't have to be that way." He reached out and took her hands in his, and the touch felt like fire to her skin. "Maybe you have a career, and maybe you have a family. Maybe you take a break for a while, or maybe you just figure out how to work a different schedule. Or maybe you just make it work. But just because your parents couldn't figure that out, doesn't mean that you can't." "I don't know about that," she sniffed. "You don't really have to have it all figured out right now. Really all you have to do is follow God's plan for you right now. And if you walk with Him, He will show you how to have a career, or a family, or both and do it His way. But don't just close yourself off to that idea forever." Carrie pulled her hands away from him and stood. "Maybe you're right. But I just can't do this right now. I'm sorry, Jack, I didn't mean to hurt you. I did try to tell you. I hope you understand." With that she walked away. Despite the walls she had built and her careful plan, she felt like she had done the one thing she didn't want to do. Hurt someone she cared about so deeply. Chapter 6. The next few weeks seemed to drag on for Carrie. She went to class, ate meals, and studied. A few times she would get a group text from her friends, but usually she made excuses for why she couldn't join them to hang out. She knew she was avoiding them, and she assumed they did too. But she didn't know what else to do. So she did what she had told everyone she needed to do: she focused on school. With finals approaching, that wasn't hard to do. Still, she often found herself wondering what Jack was doing and sometimes even thought about calling to talk. But she always stopped herself. She still talked to Rachel, and they walked together to classes, but neither one of them brought up Jack. It was only a few days before finals when the two friends were walking and talking about their plans for summer. "I'll be at my parents' house all summer, working and saving money for next year." "It stinks to be away from Scott the whole summer though," Rachel said. "Oh yeah," Carrie's thoughts drifted and her voice seemed far away. Rachel must have noticed, because she changed the subject. "What about you? What are you doing this summer?" "I've decided to stay here. My parents agreed that it was a good idea, so I'm moving to an apartment off campus. I'll take a couple of summer classes, and I'm hoping to volunteer at one of the hospitals." "Oh wow, an apartment, that's exciting." "Yes, it should be," Carrie said. "And being at the hospital would be a great experience." "I hope so. I've put in applications, so I'm waiting to hear back." "I'm sure you'll get it, you're a shoo-in." "Thanks," Carrie tried to smile. A month ago she would have been sure about it, but she wasn't sure about anything anymore. "I better get back to my room. I've got studying to do." "Do you really?" Rachel asked. "What? Do you really have studying to do? You've been saying that a lot lately, but we just haven't seen you much." "I know, she wanted to tell her friend the truth, but she just couldn't. I've just got a lot going on. It will ease up after finals are over." "Okay, well let's at least hang out before everyone leaves town." "We will," Carrie said, but she wasn't sure that was a promise she could keep. "I'll see you later." She turned towards her dorm. She just couldn't bring herself to admit to Rachel that she was afraid none of her friends would like her after how she treated Jack. And she was more afraid to see Jack in person. Finals week had arrived and Carrie hadn't stopped for a minute. She had been determined to bring her grade in chemistry back up to an A. Now, for better or worse, all her finals were over, and she had nothing better to do than refresh her final grades page on the university website every few minutes, waiting for her professors to post her grade. She tried distracting herself by packing up the rest of her dorm room. She could move into her new apartment the next day. But packing and moving was daunting since she hadn't asked any of her friends to help her. She had no idea how long it might take her to move all her things. She considered it lucky that she had used the university furniture in her dorm, and that her parents had ordered furniture to be delivered to the apartment. At least that was one less thing to worry about. Tired of being in her room, she decided to wander around campus. She stopped in at the university post office and checked her box. Usually it was just filled with junk mail, so she didn't have high hopes, but she opened it anyway. She was surprised to see a single envelope inside addressed to her. She pulled it out and glanced at the return address, Auburn Children's Hospital. Her eyes grew wide and she hurried to open the letter. "Dear Ms. Stevens," it began, "we are pleased to extend to you an offer to join us as a volunteer." She couldn't read any further before she nearly squealed in the middle of the post office. Carrie jumped up and down with excitement. She reached into her bag for her phone, but found it wasn't there. "I must have left it in my room," she said out loud to herself. She glanced around to see that no one else was there to see how crazy she looked, and then headed toward her dorm as fast as her legs would carry her. As soon as she opened her door, she saw her phone lying on the chair by her desk. She went to pick it up, but noticed her computer screen open to her grades page. She couldn't resist reaching up and refreshing the page. It took just a few seconds for the page to load, but then all of her grades appeared at once. Her eyes scanned the page and her heart beat furiously. "A," she shouted as she pumped her fist in the air. "All A's." She did a victory dance around her room, and then grabbed her phone. She stopped and stared at the phone in her hand. "Who should I call?" she thought. "Not my parents, they won't be surprised." She hadn't talked to her friends much lately, but maybe Rachel would be happy for her about the volunteer position. The truth hit her all at once and harder than she could have expected. There was really only one person that she wanted to call and share her good news with. Jack. Slowly she sat down in her desk chair and covered her face with her hands. "What have I done?" she said as the tears began to fall. "What good does it do to work this hard and get what I want if I don't even have anyone to call and share the good news with?" For several minutes she let herself cry. Once she gathered herself together, she determined to make a plan. "I don't know if I can fix this," she said, "but I'm sure going to try." Chapter 7. The plan had been pretty simple, but she was beyond grateful to her friends who hadn't given up on her. When Carrie called Rachel and told her the good news, she was quick to tell her that she knew she wanted to tell Jack, but she didn't think he would want to talk to her. Rachel went to work talking to their group of friends. Everyone agreed to the plan without a bit of hesitation. Carrie went to tears again at their acceptance and support. Then they set things into motion. Mike sent out a text to the whole group. "Finals are over, who's up for pizza tonight?" Everyone, except Carrie, began to respond that they were in. Jack was the last to respond and agree to go. Carrie folded her hands on the table, trying to keep from shaking with nerves. She sat alone in the large booth that her friends usually shared, and kept checking the time on her watch. She looked up when she heard the door open. Right on time, Jack walked in the door. He took a few steps in and looked toward the table. His eyes locked on Carrie and he stopped in his tracks. At first he looked uncertain if he should come to the table. He glanced around as if he might be looking for his friends, and then slowly he walked to the table and sat opposite Carrie. "Hi," he said, his eyes looked kind despite his shock. "Hey," Carrie said, her voice trembling. "I didn't expect you to be here." "I know, I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry, I'm glad you're here." "Just surprised. I haven't seen you in a while." "No one has." "I know, and I'm sorry about that too. But I wanted to talk to you." "Okay," he seemed hesitant. "Jack, I didn't mean to hurt you. I definitely never wanted to do that." He held his hands up. "Please, don't, it's my fault. I should have listened when you said you didn't want to go out with me. I was bullheaded and I should have let it go." She laughed, Maybe you were a little determined, but it's not your fault. You were being true to who you are. Jack ran his fingers through his hair. I guess that's right. I was always honest. Yes, you were. And I thought I was being honest with you, because it's what I was telling myself. But I found out I wasn't being honest with myself. Really? Everything I said about my parents is true, and the way I felt was true, but I don't think those feelings were right. You were right when you said just because my parents handled something a certain way doesn't mean I have to do the same. Honestly, I don't know everything that the future holds. But today I found out two exciting things, good things for me. Oh, what? He raised his eyebrows in anticipation. She smiled, knowing he was interested in what had happened made her all the more certain about her feelings. We'll get to that in a minute. But the point is, I found out the news and all I wanted to do was call and tell you about it. But I couldn't. You could have. He reached out and touched her hands. I didn't think I could. Always, he said. But thinking that I couldn't made me realize something. I don't want to go through life with no one to tell my good news to. I've tried to fight it, but you've been there for me for everything the last 2 years, good and bad. And when you took me on that picnic, I felt it. Felt what? That you weren't just my friend. What we have is too special for that. And today I knew that you are the person that I want to call and share my good news with. Always. His smile broke out on his face from ear to ear. Really, he laced his fingers with hers. Yes, really, she smiled. Carrie, I've wanted to be more than friends since the day we met. She felt herself blush. Yes, I think you've been pretty clear, she laughed. He laughed too, but he surprised her when he stood and moved to join her on the other side of the booth. Her heart pounded and she slid over to make room. He took both her hands in his again, and their eyes locked on each other. But I need you to know, Carrie, I'm all in. I don't want to be just friends, and I don't want you to say we can be together just because you don't want to lose our friendship. Her tone grew serious. I know, that's not what I'm saying. We've been friends for a long time, but I've seen the more than friends version of Jack now. And, she paused to keep her voice from shaking, that's the Jack that I want. Jack wrapped his arms around her and pressed his cheek against hers. Warmth spread over her from head to toe. She could barely breathe when he pulled back, and their faces were only inches apart. He waited just a moment before he tilted his head and closed the gap. Their lips met gently and briefly as her hands came up to cradle his face. He leaned back to look her in the eyes and said, "Are you sure?" She laughed, "Oh, I'm sure." His smile lit up his face. Her arms went around his neck as he kissed her again, longer this time. And she kissed him back with all the certainty she had. Loud cheers and whooping and hollering rang out as their friends began to surround them. Carrie pulled back and covered her face for just a moment. "It's about time," Rachel shouted. "I guess I was just the last one to know." Carrie smiled at her friends as she snuggled up to Jack's side. "Yes, I'm pretty sure you are." Jack kissed her forehead and put his arm around her shoulder. Mike called out, "Can we eat now? I'm starving." Carrie couldn't help but laugh along with her friends as the group joined them around the table. She couldn't believe how lucky she was to have this group of friends who stood beside her no matter what. As they discussed pizza toppings and drinks, she could hardly hear all the words for the joy bubbling inside of her. She glanced at Jack and found him staring back at her. She leaned in for a quick kiss and whispered, "I'll share with you." "Really?" he said. She smiled for him alone, always. This has been Just Maybe by Hannah Jo Abbott. For more books, visit www.hannahjoabbott.com. Don't miss more audiobooks available on this channel. These books are also available in ebook and paperback format exclusively from Amazon.